Snow drifted down over the frontier town, like sifted flour from a careless hand. The sky was a low ceiling of gray, and every breath hung white in the frozen air. Boards creaked beneath boots. Hitching posts were wrapped in frost, and the sound of iron striking iron rang faint from the blacksmith's corner, swallowed quickly by the cold. In the square, where the gallows loomed like an old tree stripped bare, another post had been set, and to it a man was bound. His frame was broad, his coat removed, his shoulders bare to the biting wind. He did not flinch. The mountain man had always been a figure apart, wandering in and out of the town like a shadow carried down from the peaks. He traded pelts, mended his rifle at the smithy, bought salt and flour, and then vanished again into the timbered silence. Few knew his name. Fewer dared to ask. Now he stood stripped before them, accused not of theft nor murder, but of a crime the town considered worse, standing between one of their own and a Lakota girl. She stood just beyond the circle of onlookers, wrapped in a thin blanket, dark hair catching snowflakes that clung and melted against her lashes. Her eyes, wide and unyielding, never left him. She had been shoved, insulted, nearly struck in the street the day before. He had stepped forward then, wordless, and caught the raised hand before it landed. The confrontation had ended with fists, with anger, with the mountain man dragged off in chains while the girl was herded away like something less than human. And now this. 50 lashes, decreed not for breaking the law, but for breaking the unspoken boundary the townsfolk clung to with pride and fear. Around the square, voices murmured. A fool's pity. Deserves what he gets. Always was half wild himself. The elders had chosen silence as their verdict, letting the punishment speak instead. The marshal, stiff in his long coat, stood with whip coiled at his side, waiting for the moment to begin. His breath rose in clouds, his eyes flat and cold as slate. The mountain man did not beg. He had the look of someone who had long ago made peace with pain. His skin was already latticed with scars, old wounds earned from animals, storms, perhaps battles no one here would ever know. Yet as he waited, he kept his head high, eyes steady on the snow swirling down. The girl shifted. A man beside her muttered something sharp in her tongue, pulling her back into the shadows. She resisted for only a breath, her fingers lifting from her blanket as though reaching for the man's unseen hand. Then she let it fall again. The whip cracked once in the air, a warning, and all murmurs hushed. Children were pulled closer to skirts. Men set their jaws, some with satisfaction, others with unease. The sound was loud against a hush of snow, echoing like gunfire in the stillness. The marshal's voice cut through the cold. 50? May this stand as witness to what comes a crossing where a man ought not step. The girl's head bent. The mountain man gave no answer. The first lash struck, a sharp report against flesh that broke and welled red at once. His body jolted, but he did not cry out. His breath hissed between his teeth. Nothing more. The whip coiled back, fell again, tore again. By the 5th, his back was streaked and raw, crimson staining the white at his feet. By the 10th, the snow was no longer white. Each stroke was deliberate. The marshal's arm unhurried, as though he meant to etch into skin not just punishment but humiliation. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some smiled, others frowned, yet none stepped forward. The girl's breath trembled in the air. She pressed a hand against her mouth to silence the sound rising in her throat. Her eyes glistened, not from the cold but from what she saw written across the man's shoulders. Still he did not break. His silence became its own kind of defiance, a wall against her scorn. By 20 lashes, the murmurs returned. He'll not last a count. Prideful fool. Would have been easier to let the girl take her licks. But in those words lay the truth none wished to name. He had chosen to suffer in her stead, chosen to be shamed so she would not. The lashes slowed. The marshal's arm grew weary, yet the man endured, swaying but unfallen. Snow clung to his hair, his beard, the ridges of muscle straining under torn skin. He looked less like a man and more like some iron figure, unyielding even as he bled. And the girl, she did not look away. Not once. She whispered words no one else could hear, a prayer perhaps, or a promise. Her tears froze at the edges of her lashes, unwept but shining. The last lash fell with a sound like thunder across the square. The man staggered but stood, head bowed, chest heaving. The whip dangled limp in the marshal's hand. Silence followed, long and deep. Then, slowly, the townsfolk dispersed, their boots crunching on hard snow, their whispers trailing into the cold. No one came to help. Only she lingered. When the square was nearly empty, she moved forward. Her feet left light prints across the blood-stained white. She carried nothing but the thin shawl draped about her shoulders. Gently, she set across his torn back, the cloth darkening where it touched blood. For a heartbeat he did not move, as though he had not noticed. Then he turned his head, eyes meeting hers. There was no speech, no gratitude, no plea, just a hollow rasp of his breath and a fire in her gaze, steady as the falling snow. The moment lasted until her family's voices called sharp behind her. She stepped back at once, drawn away. The shawl remained on his shoulders. He watched her retreat into the shadows until she vanished. The mountain man stood alone then, shoulders bowed, snow gathering where blood had fallen. And though the square was empty, he knew the town's judgment had only begun. But in her eyes, before she left, he had seen something else. Not pity, not fear, something that felt like a promise hidden beneath the hush of snow. That night, as the wind howled over the roofs and smoke coiled skyward, he would carry that promise with him into the dark. Snowflakes drifted like ash from a quiet fire, settling over the square long after the crowd had gone. What remained was silence and the red-streaked path where the mountain man had been cut free. He had staggered only a few paces before collapsing, his knees sinking into the frozen ground, his hands braced against the blood-speckled snow. Breath rasped in him like a bellows with no rhythm left. The lash marks ran from shoulder to waist, raw and open, each one a ribbon of pain stitched into flesh. Yet even there on his knees, he had not begged. The marshal had turned away at once, coil of whip heavy at his side. The punishment was finished. The law, or what the town called law, had spoken. No one lingered to lift the man from the ground. No one dared, or perhaps no one cared. In their eyes he was tainted now, branded not just with scars but with shame. The square emptied like a theater after a grim performance, boots crunching through hard snow, voices already twisting the tale into something sharper, crueler. She did not leave. The Lakota girl remained in the shadow of a doorway, the shawl pulled tight, her breath feathering the cold air. For a long moment she watched him, the man who had taken their hatred upon his back. When the silence stretched and the last footsteps faded, she stepped into the open, her bare feet pressed into snow. She moved quickly, kneeling at his side, her hand small against his torn shoulders. He shuddered at the touch, not from fear but from the sting of open flesh. She whispered in her tongue, a sound like river water running under ice. No one else heard it but him. His head lifted, eyes heavy with pain, and their gaze met again in the gray hush. He tried to rise, pride stiffening his frame, but his legs faltered. She slid under his arm, steadying him though her frame was slight. Together, slow and halting, they left the square behind. The path to his cabin wound to the edge of town, past lanterns glowing weak in the snowstorm. Shutters cracked as eyes peeked from inside, whispers stirring the warm air. "Look at her," someone muttered. "Shameless." Another voice, harsher, spat. He chose his grave. Let him lie in it. Their words fell like stones, but neither of them slowed. By the time they reached the cabin, night had fallen. The door groaned against the wind as she pushed it open, guiding him in. The room was dim, the fire low, its light flickering across a rough-hewn table and walls lined with pelts. He sagged onto a stool, teeth clenched against the pain. Blood stained the floor in dark trails. She moved without hesitation. From her shawl, she unwrapped a pouch of herbs, dried leaves, and roots. She pressed them into a pot, filled it with snow, set it over the fire. The scent of smoke and resin filled the room. Her hands were steady, practiced, though her eyes brimmed with something raw and quiet. When she returned to him, she carried strips of cloth torn from her blanket. Gently, she cleaned the wounds, each touch careful but unflinching. He winced, muscles jumping beneath her fingers, but he did not push her away. He watched her instead, the firelight painting her face in soft glow. The silence between them thickened, broken only by the crack of wood and his ragged breath. At last he spoke, voice hoarse from the cold. "You should not be here." She did not answer in words. She only dipped the cloth again, pressed it firm to a lash mark until the bleeding slowed. Her eyes lifted briefly to his, dark and steady, and then lowered once more. Outside, the storm grew fierce. Snow piled against the door, wind howling like wolves circling a camp. The cabin shuddered, yet inside there was a fragile stillness. The man's pain ebbed with the warmth of the fire and the girl's careful tending. Shame, however, lingered sharper than the wounds. He had endured the lashes, yes, but at what cost? His standing in the town was gone. His name, whatever worth it carried, was spoken now with scorn. She seemed to sense it. When the worst of the bleeding was stanched, she set the pot aside and took a small piece of sinew cord from her pouch. Threading beads of bone and shell onto it with fingers nimble from years of craft, she worked in silence. He watched her, puzzled at first, then weary. When she finished, she slipped the cord over his wrist. It was not a word, not a vow, but it was something more enduring, a mark of kinship, of recognition. His eyes met hers again, and for the first time that day, something softened in him. The hours passed. He dozed in the chair, the crackle of fire lulling him. Each time he stirred, he found her near, seated cross-legged on the floor, singing softly in her language. The tune wound low and mournful, yet carried a strength that reached into him deeper than any words could. He closed his eyes and let it hold him. By dawn, the storm had quieted. Pale light spilled into the cabin through the cracks in the shutters. His body ached, raw and stiff, but he still breathed. He shifted, and she looked up from where she sat, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion but steady. "Why?" he asked at last, voice low. She did not speak. She only reached for a log, set upon the fire, and fed the flame. The light leapt higher, filling the cabin, warming the silence between them. When he tried again to rise, his strength failed him. She steadied him once more, and this time he let her, pride giving way to necessity. Their hands lingered in that hold longer than they needed to. The day moved slow. Outside, townsfolk passed and whispered. None dared enter, but their voices carried on the wind. They told stories of shame, of a man broken for the sake of a girl who was not his. Yet inside, another story was unfolding. It was quiet, unseen, but strong. Two souls bound not by declaration, but by the endurance of pain shared and the small acts of care that stitched something greater than words. As night returned, he lay upon his bed, wounds bound, body trembling less with each hour. She sat near the fire, her silhouette framed by its glow. The storm outside had passed, but in its place there was a deeper stillness. Before sleep claimed him, his eyes found hers again. No words passed. None were needed. And in that silence, blood on the snow outside and fire within, something unspoken was set between them, something that would not be undone. The snow lay heavy on the cabin roof, a thick white quilt that muffled the sound of the world beyond. Each morning began in silence, broken only by the pop of embers and the slow creak of the man rising to meet the pain carved into his back. The lash marks had begun to close, but the ache lingered in every movement. His strength was not what it had been, and that truth pressed on him as firmly as the frost pressing against the logs of the cabin. The girl tended him without question. Her steps were light across the floorboards, her hands careful as she ground herbs, boiled them into poultices, and laid them across his torn flesh. Her face betrayed no fear, no pity, only quiet resolve. He bore her touch in silence, though sometimes his jaw tightened against the sting. Each act of care was a reminder of the choice he had made, of the cost he now carried. The town had not forgotten. Their whispers reached even here, carried by travelers who came to trade or to gossip. Some called him broken, others fool, still others whispered worse. He listened but said nothing. Shame was a weight he had long grown used to bearing. Yet now, with her presence beside him, the weight shifted. It was no lighter, but it was no longer his alone. At times he tried to rise too soon, to split logs or carry water, and his wounds would tear open again. He would curse under his breath, fists clenched, pride stinging sharper than the pain. And each time she would take the axe from his hand, or the bucket and do the work herself. He would watch, torn between anger at his weakness and awe at her quiet strength. One morning, the wind rattling the shutters, he found her outside in the snow, kneeling by a stump, splitting kindling with careful strikes. Her hands were reddened from the cold, her breath pluming in the air. He stepped into the doorway, leaning against the frame, his body frail, but his voice steady. "That's my work," he muttered. She paused, lifted her gaze, and met his eyes. Without a word, she set another piece of wood, raised the axe, and split it clean. The sound rang through the frozen air, sharp and sure. She did not argue, did not boast. She simply returned to the task, and something in him softened, though he did not show it. Inside the cabin, the days were slower. She brought beads and sinew from her pouch, stringing patterns in the firelight. He would watch her fingers move, deft and certain, the small shapes of bone and shell clicking softly. Once he asked, "What do they mean?" She looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the flame. She touched her chest, then pointed to him, then to the fire between them. He did not fully understand, yet he felt the meaning settle in him all the same. Nights were the hardest. Pain returned with the stillness, creeping through his muscles like frost. Sleep came fitful. Often he woke to find her humming low, the sound carrying like wind across the prairie. It was not a song he knew, yet it reached into him, steadying his breath. He never asked her to stop. In the quiet of those nights, the central conflict of his soul grew sharp. He was torn between the shame the town laid upon him and the quiet bond forming here, hidden away from their eyes. He feared what her presence meant for her as much as for him. He feared the burden of her kindness, but he also feared the thought of her leaving. One evening, after a day of heavy snow, he attempted to cut wood again. His strength failed, and he stumbled, the axe falling into the drift. She rushed him, her hand gripping his arm, steadying him. Their eyes locked, closer than they had ever been, and for the first time he did not pull away. Her hand lingered, warm against his chilled skin, and in that touch there was no shame, no pity, only something steady, something true. He spoke then, his voice rough with unsaid words. "You should be with your people." Her eyes did not waver. She pressed her palm to his chest, just above the scars, and shook her head. The meaning was clear. She had chosen her place, and it was here, with him, for reasons he could not name but dared not question. The days stretched into weeks. His wounds closed more each morning, the raw red fading to scars. He found strength in small measures, lifting logs again, carrying buckets without stumbling. Each victory was shared silently between them, her faint smile enough to mark the moment. But outside their cabin, the world did not rest. Whispers in town thickened, tongues sharper than the cold. Some muttered that she bewitched him. Others feared what her family might do when they returned to find her under his roof. Fear, prejudice, and pride brewed like storm clouds ready to break. Inside, the fire grew warmer, and so did the bond between them. It was not spoken. It did not need to be. It was built in the moment she stitched his wounds, in the times he reached to steady her when the wind caught her shawl, in the shared silence as they listened to the winter night. Each act, small and quiet, lay another stone in the foundation of something larger than either of them. One night, as the snow fell thick and heavy, he found her by the window, watching the storm. The firelight traced her profile, the beads at her wrist catching the glow. He stepped closer, slow from stiffness, and stood beside her. Outside, the world was lost in white, endless and unbroken. Inside, their breaths mingled, warm against the chill. He whispered then, not looking at her, "I don't know what tomorrow brings." She turned, her hand finding his, rough palm against her smaller one. She squeezed once, firm, her eyes steady. It was answer enough. The storm howled, rattling the door, yet in that small cabin there was a calm the outside world could not touch. And though he did not know what judgment or trial awaited beyond the thaw, he knew this much. Winter had given him more than scars. It had given him a reason to bear them. The wind howled across the prairie that morning, scouring the frozen ground with knives of snow, as if the land itself meant to strip bare the last threads of hope before spring. Caleb Boone stood at the edge of camp, hat pulled low, his shoulders stiff from the lingering ache of lash scars. Beneath his coat, the wounds burned when the cold seeped in, a cruel reminder of what he'd paid for a girl whose people did not yet trust him. Ayanna stepped from her family's lodge wrapped in a blanket of wolf fur, her dark hair braided with beads that clicked softly in the wind. She carried herself with a quiet grace, but her eyes flicked toward Caleb often, weighing him, as if she still had not decided whether he would protect her or stranger. Around them, her kin moved deliberately, elders speaking in low voices, while warriors sharpened blades or repaired gear for the winter hunt. There was purpose in the air, something brewing that Caleb could not yet name. The night before, whispers had spread like sparks in dry grass. The elders would speak of a pact, a binding word between peoples. Caleb had not slept much since. He leaned against a pine at the camp's edge and wondered if he was about to be claimed as kin or cast out as a fool who had bled for nothing. The council fire was lit at dusk. Shadows grew long over the snow, and the Lakota gathered in a circle, their breaths steaming in the frigid air. Caleb was beckoned forward by two eagles. Ayanna's uncle, a man with lines of wisdom etched deep into his face, and a gaze that cut sharper than flint. You stood for her when no one else did. Two eagles said, his words deliberate, measured. The whip that struck your back was meant to teach you fear. Instead, you bore without faltering. Such endurance does not go unnoticed. Caleb inclined his head, though his jaw tightened. I did what I thought was right. Nothing more. Two eagles studied him for a long moment, then gestured for him to sit near the fire. Ayanna lowered herself beside her mother, keeping her eyes lowered, though Caleb caught the faintest flicker of curiosity when she risked a glance at him. It was White Elk, the elder with hair like winter sage, who finally spoke the words Caleb had dreaded and longed for in equal measure. There's been much talk. Some wish to turn you away, mountain man. Some believe the blood of our daughters should not mingle with the blood of white man, but others see a different path. You risked your life for Ayanna. Perhaps that was a sign. Perhaps the spirits sent you here to bind two worlds. A murmur rippled through the circle. Caleb felt the weight of every eye. His hand twitched toward the scars beneath his coat, as though to remind himself he had already given proof of his intent. White Elk raised his hand for silence. A pact has been offered. Ayanna is of age and strong of spirit. You are marked by sacrifice. If she consents, we will bind her to you. But know this, if you accept her, you accept all of us. You will not walk as an outsider, but as kin. Betray that bond, and you will answer not only to her, but to the whole of the Lakota. The fire popped, sending sparks into the night sky. Ayanna lifted her head, meeting Caleb's eyes fully for the first time. There was no softness in her gaze, only the steel of a woman weighing the man before her. I do not want pity, she said in her tongue, her voice steady. If I am to be given, it will not be because a white man bled in my stead. I want a husband who sees me, who knows my worth. The word struck Caleb harder than any lash. He swallowed, throat tight, and forced himself to speak plainly. I won't deny I acted in anger at the injustice, but it was not pity that drove me. I've seen cruelty enough in this world to know when it must be stood against. You deserve better than to be treated as chattel. If that earns your respect, then I'll count it worth the scars. Ayanna studied him, silent. The firelight flickered across her face, painting her expression unreadable. Finally, she turned to her mother, who nodded once, then back to White Elk. I will not refuse. Let him prove with his hands and his deeds that his words are not hollow. The decision was sealed with murmurs of agreement, though not all voices carried welcome. Some eyes still burned with suspicion. Caleb felt it, like a circle of knives pressed close around his ribs. Yet in the midst of it, Ayanna's gaze lingered on him, less sharp now, more questioning, as though she, too, wondered what fate had set between them. The days that followed were uneasy. Word of the pact spread beyond the camp, stirring talk in neighboring settlements. Some traders muttered that Caleb Boone had gone soft. Others whispered that he was cunning, seeking advantage by marrying into Lakota kin. A few simply spat his name and called him traitor to his own kind. Caleb bore in silence, but the weight of it pressed heavy each time he crossed paths with Ayanna, who seemed to test him with every glance. The test came sooner than he expected. A band of hunters returned with news that a party of settlers had been seen near the river, armed and restless. Tensions flared quickly. Lakota warriors wanted to drive them off, fearing encroachment. Caleb found himself summoned again before two eagles. "You are bound to us now," the elder said. "Your word may carry weight with your people. Will you go and speak, to keep peace where blood might spill?" It was no small request. Settlers eyed him already as suspect. To stand openly with a Lakota might brand him outlaw among his own. Yet when Caleb looked at Ayanna, she did not turn away. For the first time, he thought he saw a glimmer of faith in her eyes. Faint but real. "I'll go," Caleb said. The meeting at the river was tense, wind whipping across the frozen water. The settlers stood stiff and hostile, rifles at their sides, while Lakota held spears and bows. Caleb walked between them, every step a knife edge. He spoke plain, appealing to reason, to the common hardship of winter and the promise of trade when spring thaw came. Some of the settlers sneered, spitting at his feet, calling him Red Lover. His blood boiled, but he held steady, forcing calm into his voice. Slowly, grudgingly, the settlers relented, backing down with mutters of warning. The Lakota, too, eased their grips, though suspicion lingered in their eyes. When Caleb returned to camp, shoulders heavy with exhaustion, he found Ayanna waiting by the fire. She rose as he approached, her face solemn. "You faced their scorn for us," she said. "You did not falter." Caleb met her gaze. "I gave my word." Something shifted between them then, subtle as the thawing of ice under sun. She reached into her blanket and pulled out a strip of red cloth, bound with beads. With deliberate care, she tied it around his wrist. "Then let this mark you as mine, as much as those scars mark you as ours." The fire cracked, sending sparks into the night. Caleb looked down at the cloth, then back at Ayanna, his chest tight with something he could not yet name. Around them, whispers rose. The pact was no longer just talk. It was lived, chosen, tested by fire and ice. Yet even as warmth flickered in his chest, Caleb knew shadows still lingered on the horizon. Settlers would not forgive his choice, nor would all Lakota accept him as kin. But for the first time since the lash fell, he felt more than pain. He felt purpose. And beside him, Ayanna's steady gaze promised both trial and triumph to come. The winter night deepened, stars burning cold above. The world remained harsh, divided, uncertain. Yet in that circle of firelight, with the red cloth tied around his wrist and Ayanna's eyes locked on his, Caleb Boone knew that the storm ahead would not break him. It would forge him. And in that forging, perhaps, a marriage pact would become more than survival. Perhaps it would become the bond that bridged two worlds.